It was too dark in these storage places to see well. Rats were nuisances, and the packers would put poison bread out for them. Then, the rats, bread, and meat would go into the hoppers together.
This was the grim reality for late 19th century workers in Packingtown, Chicago, as societal barriers broke Americans' trust in the food industry. This lack of sanitation was due to poor government regulation, which demonstrated the political hold that businesses had at the time. Due to the lack of food safety regulations and poor working conditions alongside wages, the cleanliness of the food was compromised. A journalist named Upton Sinclair set out to Chicago to uproot the truths hidden from the public, which he ultimately published in his book, The Jungle. In the beginning of the 20th century, there was a huge economic boom. Industrialization took hold of the nation and changed the face of America. It gave rise to urbanization, as more people looked for jobs in the cities, and more immigrants came to America in search of the American dream. With this mass influx of people, cities began to flourish, one of the biggest being Chicago. In 1870, immigrants made up around 48% of Chicago's population. Prior to 1906, meatpacking factory conditions in America were horrid. Meat was often rancid. To fix this, factories used chemicals to change the flavor and color so the public wouldn't notice. Many workers received infections from handling contaminated meat and working with cold meat for long periods of time. Workers were disgusted by the factory conditions, but had no option but to endure them. Jobs in this field were easily filled. This made many workers susceptible to losing a workplace at any moment.
And the employers, the big meat packers, hire in those newer immigrants at lower wages and use them to break apart the power of the skilled workers.
During the Gilded Age, people cared more about their own survival than the condition of the products they made or the factories they worked in. The economic instability that preceded the Gilded Age caused many workers to take any job that was offered to them, regardless of conditions. This eagerness to fill jobs led many factory owners to cut corners in safety, knowing people would still take the unsafe jobs. Upton Sinclair was a 28-year-old journalist when he wrote The Jungle. Sinclair was born in Baltimore and graduated at the College of the City of New York and studied at Columbia University. In order to gather evidence and be able to truly expose the vile aspects of the meat industry, Sinclair had to go and experience things firsthand. Sinclair traveled to Packingtown, Chicago in 1904, where meat companies took
crippled and diseased cattle to be canned.
Originally, Sinclair hoped to gain sympathy for the workers, but the public seemed to focus more on the contaminated meat. The Jungle, written by Upton Sinclair in 1906, broke societal barriers regarding Americans' trust in the food industry by bringing up unsanitary and unsafe conditions in meatpacking factories. The Jungle also established legal barriers such as the Pure Food and Drug Act, along with the Meat Inspection Act of 1906, to guarantee safe food manufacturing and consumption. However, The Jungle's publication was unsuccessful in breaking the moral barriers that limited public sympathy for working conditions in meatpacking plants. After the publication of The Jungle, public outlash against the meat industry was high. The sale of meat was cut in half and people demanded regulation. People stated that The Jungle
made everyone amazed, disgusted, interested.
After the public outlash was clear, meatpacking owners tried to deny Sinclair's allegations. One meatpacker plant owner said that,
"I found an increasing difficulty to keep silent under a long series of onslaughts by the professional agitators of the country, knowing those attacks to be unfair, unjust, untrue, and in most cases maliciously bitter."
Sinclair sent letters to President Theodore Roosevelt demanding change. Sinclair suggested he
find a man, let him go to Packingtown as a working man, get a job in the yards, and see if he does not come out at the end of a few weeks feeling that the conditions of the packing houses constitute a menace to the health of the civilized world.
Prompted by such pressures, President Roosevelt ordered a secret investigation into Sinclair's claims. After less than 3 weeks in Chicago, the investigators said,
"Lard is manufactured from hogs which die from cholera. The meat inspectors are incompetent. The sanitary conditions at the packing houses are revolting. The packers use preservatives, and the meat is sold to Americans which is deemed unfit for exportation to Europe."
The undeniable societal and economic barriers that meatpacking plants broke regarding people's trust in the food industry was enough to convince Congress to regulate the meatpacking industry. Following the release of Sinclair's book, the federal government took notice. After a series of correspondences between President Roosevelt and Upton Sinclair, Roosevelt ordered investigations to look into the conditions involved with the production of meat goods and their distribution. Shortly following this, the United States government established legal barriers regarding the conditions of meatpacking factories. The investigations updated the 1890 and 1891 meat inspection laws to the Meat Inspection Act of 1906. This investigation also revealed the deplorable conditions of meatpacking plants, such as unsanitary working conditions and non-food items going into the meat. The inspection was not the only factor that led to the establishment of legal barriers. It was also the mountains of public pressure that Roosevelt received following the release of the jungle and the letters Roosevelt exchanged with Upton Sinclair. The Meat Inspection Act of 1906 stated,
Meat food products which are unsound, unhealthy, unwholesome, or otherwise unfit for use as human food, the Secretary of Agriculture may order inspectors to examine and inspect all cattle, sheep, swine, and goats before they shall be allowed to enter any slaughtering, packing, meat canning, rendering, or similar establishment.
This meant that no diseased animals could make it to meatpacking factories, which lowered the amount of people in factories who were affected by the diseases the animals carried. The Meat Inspection Act of 1906 was not the only barrier established to protect the public. There was also the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906, which took harmful or possibly harmful foods and drugs off the market. Both these acts helped lead to the creation of the Food and Drug Administration. The jungle tried and failed to break the moral barrier that prevented Americans from caring about the plight of immigrant workers. Even the president, Theodore Roosevelt, overlooked this factor after reading the novel. Sinclair
had objected to Roosevelt that he was giving all of his attention to the subject of meat inspection and none to the subject of labor inspection.
Without labor inspection, workers were susceptible to infections. Those who had the misfortune of being assigned the pickling room often developed pickled hands, an infection brought from handling the cold meat. Hands would crack down to the bone and take months to heal.
Let a man so much as scrape his finger pushing the truck in a pickle room, and he might have a sore that would put him out of the world. All the joints in his fingers might be eaten by the acid, one by one.
Even though there were a plethora of letters regarding the conditions of the meat from the public, there were little to no letters about the conditions the workers faced. This exemplifies the moral barrier of selfishness that Sinclair hoped to break. Although there were many explicit descriptions of the conditions workers in the meatpacking plants endured, the public zoned in on the part that directly affected them, the conditions of the meat they were consuming.
And what happened to the people that read the book is they didn't really care about the workers, they cared about the meat.
This lack of regard for workers' safety from the public, in the words of Sinclair,
caused the whitewashing of some packing house walls, but it left the wage slaves in those huge brick packing boxes exactly where they were before.
The public's moral barriers were left stiffly in place despite Sinclair's efforts to break them down and create a new standard for safety for workers. When Upton Sinclair wrote The Jungle in 1906, the novel broke societal barriers regarding people's trust in the food industry by telling the public the horrible ways that food was being processed. The Jungle established legal barriers, such as the Pure Food and Drug Act and Meat Inspection Act of 1906, to guarantee safe food manufacturing and consumption. However, The Jungle's publication was unsuccessful in breaking the moral barriers that limited public sympathy for working conditions in meatpacking plants. How did The Jungle affect modern society? The passing of the Pure Food and Drug Act and the Meat Inspection Act of 1906 gave regulatory powers to the federal government and also legitimized a bureau that turned into today's Food and Drug Administration.
There's a big impact that the jungle had on evolution or the creation of the FDA, because that book highlighted a number of risks that were in food products being processed in some factories, and those conditions delineated in that book, and that caught the attention of the public as well as Congress. And so that initiated action by the government to try to step in and assure that there were laws in place so that food was produced safely and wholesomely.
Today, the FDA inspects much of the food that ends up in American homes and gets rid of the potentially harmful food. An example of the FDA at work is the salmonella outbreaks that started in 1996, where people got salmonella from all sorts of food, like Mexican marital papayas. The outbreaks resulted in 1,392 hospitalizations and 34 deaths. Mexican marital papayas infected 47 people and killed one. When people started to get ill from the sporadic outbreaks, the FDA investigated and recalled several processed foods that could potentially have salmonella on September 17th of 2009. Without The Jungle being written, the FDA couldn't help prevent people from getting ill or dying from unsanitary food. Although Sinclair failed to break important moral barriers, ultimately, The Jungle was able to establish important legal barriers that protected the public. As Upton Sinclair said,
I aimed at the public's heart, and by accident I hit it in the stomach.